right, so since we're a relatively small group, if anyone has any questions, needs me to slow down or clarify anything, just raise your hand. I'm more than happy to stop. Being originally from New Jersey, I talk very fast. So if you need me to slow down, like I said, just raise your hand. And welcome to Inclusive Digital Products, Why Web Accessibility Matters. And since you guys are here, I'm assuming that you guys all care about it, which makes me very happy. So a little bit about me. I'm Gaulrapp, and I'm a front-end developer at Message Agency, and I also oversee our web accessibility initiatives. Just a little background on Message Agency. We're a full-service digital agency out of Philadelphia. We're a certified B Corp, and we work a lot with nonprofits, universities, foundations, government, and other mission-aligned for-profits. We're also a social enterprise that helps nonprofits use technology to enlighten, educate, engage, and enact change. So for the last 10 years, I worked primarily in the education technology space. In the past, I've developed digital literacy curriculum for students who have cognitive disabilities. And I've also designed and developed a learning platform that focused a lot on adult literacy and English language learning. So with a personal mission to create an inclusive web, I'm an accessibility advocate, and I'm here to help you guys fight this good fight. So I'd like to give you guys a little bit of an outline about this presentation. I broke it out into questions that by the end of this, hopefully we'll all have the answers to. We'll start by going over exactly what is web accessibility, where it started, who governs it, and some other background information to level set ourselves. Next, we'll be going into why we should all care about this, both in a humanitarian and a business sense. Then we'll talk about what you guys can start doing now or on Monday, probably, to make your projects more accessible. We'll go over different tools and strategies that you guys can implement at any stage of your project. And then before we go into our Q&A portion, we'll talk about what tactics you can also start using to make it a priority. So first, what is web accessibility? We know that we understand in our physical world why we have things like ramps into buildings and cutouts into sidewalk crossings, and we understand why signs have braille and why doors have push plates. And it's to provide these access to areas, information, or functionality that any given person may need. And web accessibility is an extension of that. An extension of those considerations. It's a set of best practices and guidelines that reduces or removes the barrier to entry. It also ensures that all users have equal access to this information and functionality. So where do these standards come from? So they come from the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, which is led by the inventor of the internet, Tim Berners-Lee, and he has this great quote: "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." And the W3C, for those who don't know, is an international organization that sets protocols and guidelines for ensuring the long-term growth of the web. Inside of the W3C is the Web Accessibility Initiative, which published the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG for short, and they published 1.0 in 1999. In 2008, they published 2.0, and then recently, in the last year, published 2.1, which is now considered the standard. So these guidelines have been around for 20 years, and that's a really long time, especially in the web. But what are they? So the WCAG is divided up into these 4 principles. It goes perceivable, which goes by information and user interface components must be presentable to users in the ways that they can perceive. So it means that things on our website can't be blind to all of a user's senses. Things like it's where we have alt text on images or the text equivalent of information. So if somebody's blind or is using a screen reader, or if somebody's deaf, they can still understand what is being presented to them. It also means with our videos, we have like closed captioning or titles or transcripts on them. Perceivable also means that it's able to support different assistive technologies, such as a screen reader. It also removes the reliance on shape or location or sound to navigate. So if you're like, let's say you're, reading through something and it says, oh, see the text highlighted in yellow. Well, if I'm blind, that does nothing for me. So it removes that reliance on that. The next one is operable. That means that users must be able to operate your interface, and the interface cannot require interaction that a user cannot perform. So if you have, let's say, a lot of JavaScript on your site, but that's not accessible, a user who's either going through it with the keyboard and tabbing through things, if they can't perform the same action, no bueno. And the keyboard functionality is a big one for this. This also means that there's no action timeouts. So if you've ever been on a form, let's say you're buying tickets off of Ticketmaster and it says you need to complete this form in 5 minutes, you can't have action timeouts like that. And a lot of the reasons is, let's say you have a cognitive disability and it takes you a lot more time to go through those steps and to understand and process what the information is asking you to fill out. Or if you're somebody who's older and it takes you a bit more time to type things out. So that's why we like to stay away from things like action timeouts. And operable also, we're giving alternate ways of finding things, whether it's a table of contents or a sitemap as an example. The next one is understandable. This means that users must be able to understand information as well as the operation of the user interface. The content or operation cannot be beyond their understanding. So if let's say the content of your site is using very specific language that, somebody, just stumbling upon it may not understand, providing something like a glossary for your unusual terms would be helpful. It also goes into the reading level of what your content is. And it also means giving clear definition of input requirements or error messaging. So if, let's say, I'm filling out your form and I did it incorrectly, a lot of times you'll just, when you submit it and it has errors, you'll see the little red border form around your input box. But if you don't have clear messaging, somebody who is, let's say, either has a color blindness, color vision deficiency, or is using a screen reader, how are they supposed to know that they have an error there? And then the last one is robust. It means content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. This also means that users must be able to access the content as technologies advance. Your content should be well-formed using great and correct semantic markup so it can be successfully parsed by browsers and other agents, such as screen readers. And the name and the role of our user interface components, our form inputs, buttons, and links should be able to be determined by these agents. So why should you care? Well, we all know that it's the right thing to do. We as project managers, designers, developers, we're gatekeepers. And it's our responsibility to not gate people off it's our responsibility to not gate anybody off, and to make sure that every aspect of a web page can be accessed by anybody, regardless of limitation. And in our physical world, if a blind person came up to you and asked you a question, there's no way you would say, oh, sorry, there's no room in the budget for me to answer that question, maybe in phase 2. So why would we do that in our digital world? Makes no sense. And when we don't plan for creating accessible projects and products, and integrate ways for our sites to be used by all, we're undervaluing people based on things that are out of their control. We don't have the right to do that, and personally, I think there's way too much of that in the world today. So sometimes, depending on what role we're in, it might be hard to convince people, why we should care about web accessibility. So there's some business cases that we can make, because doing the right thing can't always convince people, unfortunately. So the first on our list is that you can make a social business case for it. So there's this idea that when you solve for one, you extend to all. So making making our interfaces easier for somebody, let's say if they're using a keyboard to tab through, making it easier for them and to get to a certain place usually means that it's easier for everyone to get to a place. So for instance, you may not have a vision limitation, but if the text on a website has proper color contrast that benefits users with color blindness, on a sunny day and you're looking at your mobile phone, it's also going to be easier for you to see that text better. On the same token, having a healthy amount of line spacing and using a sans serif font not only makes it easier for us to read, but it really helps people who have dyslexia trying to read through all of that content. It also helps older folks if they're trying to zoom into content. Makes it easier for them to process that text as well. The next is the digital divide. 10% of Americans still lack high-speed internet, and this number particularly affects lower income folks. So when we conflate our sites with these insane animations and loading all of these JavaScript libraries, and we're uploading 7 megabyte pictures up into our WYSIWYG, we're creating a barrier to entry there. So things like compression, they benefit everybody. And this is becoming particularly more important when we think about things like net neutrality. And in the next couple of years, we're going to be seeing a lot more first-time internet users. So for my numbers folks here, I got some stats. By 2020, 1.1 billion people worldwide will be accessing the internet for the first time. And in America, that's 23 million people. And that is a whole lot of people. I've been on the internet since I was 5 years old, and I make websites for a living. So suffice to say, I can navigate my way through some atrocious user interface components and site architecture. And I can pick up on user interface patterns fairly quickly. But for those who aren't tech savvy, we want to make sure that the patterns that we're using are intuitive, and the instructions that we're giving for things like filling out our forms and navigating our site are clear and apparent. If our functionality differs from those that are kind of standard patterns or practices, we want to make sure that we can, we're giving extra prompts and guiding users oh, well, no, on this site, this is how you use it, and not just leave it up to the user to figure it out. We also want to make sure that we have ways to undo or back out of tasks that are on our site so people don't get stuck in places that they don't know what to do and maybe don't even know how they got there. We also can't anticipate the reading levels or the fluency of our users. Excuse me. The WCAG says that you should write your content to a 6th grade reading level. So things like chunking information, we're using headings and 5-sentence paragraphs, and writing in clear, concise language helps this population digest and understand your information better. It will probably even help if they're using something like Google Translate. Google Translate will be able to, help translate your site even better. We can also use icons to help in this area. If your content uses, words or terms that the average person may not know, we can consider putting a glossary of the unusual terms like I talked about before on your site. The next is you can make a technical case too. We're reducing our development and maintenance times. Since we're building websites against best practices, our clean code means less support tickets about Internet Explorer and one-off devices. Well, this doesn't look good on my, Android from 2008, and you need to fix this. It also means making a site redesign much easier. So and let's talk about compression a bit. When we pay close attention to how large our websites are, and we make an active effort to reduce its size, we don't need to worry as much about the load times and how many times our server is being asked to transfer data. And there's thousands of devices out there, and we can't anticipate them all. So when we're using semantic markup, it helps our users who are using older technologies still be able to use our products, and ensures that our products will still continue to work with the latest and greatest. We want to make sure that our digital products function the same on low-cost devices as it does on an iPhone X. So the average lifespan of a website can be about 3 to 5 years. At Message Agency, we really strive for that 7 to 10. And if you've ever had to migrate content from an older system into a newer system, you can know what a headache that can be. So by keeping our code and our structure and our templates and all of that stuff very clean and predictable, we can make that process even easier and faster and more cost effective. Financially, by making our websites accessible, we're increasing our market segments. 15% of the world has some form of disability, and if we add that to the number of first-time internet users, that's a whole lot of people that we're ignoring if we don't take all of this into consideration. Google also likes us better when we have well-structured content. So when the Google bot comes through and he can tell exactly what our pages are about, where everything is, we rank higher. So things like I said, using correct semantic markup and our grade 6 reading levels and alt text on our images also helps us do that. For direct cost savings, all the things we talked about on our technical slide really do apply here, from server load, maintenance, and even the cost of translating content or redesigning a site is very much minimized. And the biggest cost savings of them all is we're decreasing our legal threat, which is like potentially huge money. And web accessibility, for those of you who don't know, web accessibility related lawsuits have been on the rise. And have you guys ever heard of like patent trolls and stuff? So they're actually starting to do that now with web accessibility. So we really want to make sure that we're taking care of that in our digital projects. So for legal, and I will preface this by saying I am not a lawyer, I'm a front-end developer, but for our legal cases here, the ADA, for those of you who don't know, is the Americans with Disability Act. It was signed into law in 1990, and it prevents discrimination against a group that has historically faced many barriers. The ADA makes it illegal in this country for any government or business to provide goods and services to the public that are also not accessible to people who have disabilities. In many situations, however, it can be challenging to establish just what it means by accessible. So that's why the U.S. Department of Justice, or the DOJ, which enforces the ADA, lots of acronyms here, has issued a supplemental advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, SANPRM, to incorporate web accessibility into this standard. Organizations are encouraged to use the WCAG 2.1 level AA technical requirements as a guide to digital accessibility. So a wide range of agencies and companies are covered under the ADA. This includes state and local governments, or Title II regulations, which are termed public accommodations, Title III regulations, which are essentially any business or nonprofit organization that serves the public. Title III covers a lot of ground, including restaurants, theaters, and schools, ensuring that individuals cannot be denied entry to these places or services by these companies solely based on a disability. This includes services that are provided through a website or another digital format. Okay, so that was a lot of information to take in, and it might seem a little daunting to start, but here are some ways that regardless of what your role is, you can start incorporating web accessibility onto every stage of your project. So is anyone here a project manager or responsible for putting together scopes and budgets and all of that fun stuff? All right, these two over here. When you're first planning out your project, be clear that accessibility is a requirement and it is launch critical. It is imperative to build accessibility in and not bolt it on. I was working a contract with a university in Philadelphia where I had come on to help out with a site for their main site redesign. And at the time, I didn't know a whole lot about web accessibility, but there was something that the project manager had said. It's like, oh yeah, well, we need to get this site, we need to get this site launched by this date because we're rolling out our new brand. And, I think it needs to be like, hit some type of web accessibility, conformance. And it was only after that we had launched this that they're like, oh yeah, by the way, can you guys now go back and make this accessible? And that was a nightmare to do. If you build something a certain way and you don't have, if you're not thinking about web accessibility, depending on what system you're using and how you built out that site, it can be nearly impossible and definitely not cost effective to bolt that on. So you definitely want to build it in if you're in the position to do that. When we wait to QA to care about web accessibility, development slows down, we go over budget, and the design might even need to change. For those of you that work in an agency, if you have to meet that level AA standard and you're only testing, your design against that standard after it's launched, colors might need to change. And nobody likes being surprised with that. They're like, well, I like this orange. Like, I don't want to change that. But then, if we wait for all of that stuff to happen, it then seems like accessibility is the thing that's holding us up and that it is the problem. But in reality, it's just a process problem. So another thing is, map out exactly what conformance level you're planning to achieve and use the WCAG checklist to help write the requirements or testing scripts based off of them. Be proactive and share the same requirements across the team so you're not the only one that's thinking about this. You need everyone to be on the same page, and you also want to give people time to ask questions and get the answers that they need, because there might be implementation challenges. Be like, oh, well, if we want things like if you're putting together, calendars are very complicated to put together in a very accessible way. Because a lot of times when you have your little calendar events, if a screen reader is going through it, you'll hear like 1, 2, 3, and it's like, well, what, like, I'm not sure what these like numbers are. So, you really want to make sure that if you're building something out, you're communicating with designers and developers so that you can plan for these types of things. Also, if you have a lot of videos, if you know that, the project that you're managing is going to have a lot of videos on your site, but you need to, hit certain standards, you might need to go to your client and be like, well, you might need to spend some time putting closed captioning on this, or, pay somebody to get transcripts of that because you need a text equivalent for that, for those types of things, if that's the only place that that information is. So is anyone here do like design, UX, or information architecture? Great. You guys are like, project managers, like first line of defense, but you guys like really start to like make it shine with web accessibility. So when we're thinking about web accessibility and design and discovery, there's many things that we can do to ensure that our designs and experience are being inclusive to all users. Designing for accessibility comes with its concerns for sure, and its challenges for sure, but but good design and good designers tackle those challenges. And having an accessible website doesn't mean you have an ugly website. It doesn't have to mean that. So the first is to adopt either the universal design or inclusive design principles. Both of them are human-centric and empathetic approaches to design that puts people first. And on top of that is like putting people first. One of the things that at least I try to do is when we're talking about people with disabilities, like language is very important. You don't want to say blind people or autistic people. You want to say, people who are blind or people who have autism, because when you do it the other way, you put the disability first. And it's just a way to reinforce that, we are first humans, and then second, we may have these conditions, but we are not defined by those. So when you adopt these types of principles, your designs will become stronger and more intuitive because of it. So with accessibility, we consider vision, hearing, cognitive, and mobility limitations, but with human-centric design and inclusive design, that encompasses accessibility and tacks on things like location, gender, language, education, and age into consideration as well. So it's age, yes. Because we are going to have a lot of first-time internet users who are over the age of 65. That's like a huge population that's going to start, coming to our website. So we need to plan for those things. Oh, yes. For the universal design, they're human-centric and empathetic approaches to design. So a lot of these things, accessibility encompasses things like the vision, mobility, cognitive, and hearing limitations, but the human-centric designs takes like everything else into consideration, like location, gender, language, education, and age. So it's this idea that whether out of circumstance, choice, or context, people are diverse. And as people use different approaches and tools to read and operate interfaces, what the interface offers each user should be compatible in and comparable in value, quality, and efficiency. Is anyone here not familiar with the term personas when it comes to like UX and discovery? So a persona is when, so if you're doing like a discovery and you're trying to think about who your users are, you put it's basically a persona is putting like a name and a face to those like users. So it's usually like a fake person. So it's basically just a way to start thinking about like what type of users are, not just like, oh, we serve, we serve people who are educators. It's like, well, what specific educator? It's like, I'm an educator who has like 15 minutes a day to like look. It gives a little bit more specifics to like what an actual user like would be. But when we're making personas, it's a really good idea to make personas with limitations, and putting the names and faces and attributes to the users can be very helpful to reinforce accessibility. So if we create a few that have maybe a permanent disability like blindness or a temporary disability like having a broken hand, we're making sure that the website's experience can be extended to as many people as possible. We also want to vet our mockups and wireframes, check for things like color contrast, and make sure that all forms have labels and things like that. When our one visual designer first started, he had put together this one mock-up for a client that is supposed to hit that AA, which takes things like color contrast into consideration. And when he came to me to vet it, I was like, oh my God, I'm like, this is beautiful. But like all of these colors fail. And he had never did anything with web accessibility before. Like the idea of kind of color contrast was a little bit new to him. But since I had started that conversation with him, he like knocks it out of the park now. Like he's now, showing me accessibility events, and even just starting to have those conversations with your designers makes them stronger, one as designers and professionals, but also it makes our designs as a company or whoever we're designing it for much stronger. And kind of like on the topic of color vision deficiency, a lot of people think that like solely of people who have color blindness in this or are blind, but there was a study that recently came out from the University of Freiburg. It's in Germany, so I might be pronouncing it wrong. It came out that patients who have depression, both medicated and unmedicated depression, they have a reduced contrast sensitivity. So it's, so basically the difference between white and black is not as strong as it for somebody who doesn't have depression. And I thought that was really interesting because a lot of times you're thinking of this color blindness, but it really affects a lot more people than that. So on the topic of back to vetting mockups, we can have things like carousels, but they should not autoplay. And we should have things like a pause button so that we can stop. So a user who does have, either problems processing information is able to stop that and understand things. We can have a mega menu, but we need to have a skip navigation link in it so it's not read off to the user every time they enter a page if they're using a screen reader. And many navigations bars navigations, much like our calendars that I was talking about, leave keyboard users or screen readers like unable to access drop-down menus. Not to put Drupal Camp Atlanta on blast, but I was unable to navigate their menu with a keyboard alone. But DrupalCon also had that. Not that it makes it okay, but not just to put them on blast. And things like, I'm sure, we're all familiar with that infinite scrolling that we sometimes see. And that can be really problematic, especially for users navigating by keyboard, because they can't get past that stream. Because it's constantly refreshing, more stuff's loading, and they're like, but I need to get to the footer. So things like, so you either need a way to turn that feature off or put in a load more button. And the same goes for animations and that, that fancy parallax effect that a lot of websites seem to be incorporating nowadays. And also know in advance that, users are going to make mistakes and not use our tools the way that we think they are. So we need to test our products with all types of people. There's no use for designing, there's no use designing for empathy if we're not actually going to be testing our projects and our products with people who actually, might have these types of limitations. So we want to make sure that we're looking for input and feedback from actual users. So a lot of developers in here, right? So this is where kind of magic starts to happen, if I do say so myself. While we're in development, we want to make sure that we're actively checking the status of our accessibility, whether we're building stuff out now or we're doing a support ticket. Using tools like the Wave extension, Google's Dev Tools, you can run accessibility audits, right, from your Google Dev Tools. And you can also use command line tools such as Pally to give you insight into how you can increase your compliance. I'm also a fan of the Site Improve extension because it'll scan your page, but it breaks out it breaks out in groups alerts and errors by responsibility, like, oh, well, this is a content editor's responsibility, or this is like a developer responsibility. So I find that that's a pretty, it's an easy way to kind of see like where these problems are stemming from. And when we create our accessible websites, we're using correct and meaningful semantic markup. This helps our users who are using older technology still be able to use our products and ensures that our projects will continue to work with the latest and greatest. We'll also want to add the ARIA roles when they're necessary. A lot of times now, like HTML5, you don't need to add the ARIA roles because it's already implied, but you want to make sure that, and these types of checkers will tell you whether it's redundant or it's needed or it's not needed. And for those of you who don't know, the ARIA, the WAI ARIA roles, that stands for the Web Accessibility Initiative Accessible Rich Internet Application. So basically it adds roles, properties, and state information to dynamic web applications. And recently I've been playing a lot with the ARIA Live regions. Does anyone know what ARIA Live regions is, or not know what it is? Okay, so basically it's, so if we're like, think about when on like searches or when you're doing filtering, we have, and if you have like Ajax enabled, it's like I toggle on like, it's like, okay, I have all these like search results, but now I just want to search for like this one specific topic. So I toggle that, and then it just, doesn't cause like a page reload, but new content's displayed. What an ARIA Live region is, it's for screen readers, what it does is it gives some type of audio prompt. So it'll say like content refreshed, now showing results filtered by, this and that, like, or, showing, has 12 results showing results 1 through 4. So it's an audio cue for those to announce a change of content or context. And it's actually surprisingly easy to implement, especially with better exposed filters, and if you guys use that at all. I just put it in my in like the view header. It's very, and you can hide that from, people visually, but it's nice to have for people who, let's say, are using a screen reader. We also want to let's see. Oh, so we also want to consider responsive images and compressed images. So yes, we can blame our content editors for loading 3 megabyte pictures up into their WYSIWYG, but we can handle that a bit better on the back end. So setting up responsive images and proper image compression will help our website load faster and take in those considerations. We'll also want to artificially limit ourselves or use assistive technology during development to make sure that the changes that we're making are increasing our accessibility and not decreasing it. Whether it's tabbing through a website, that's usually, that's a really quick one to do. Or for those of you who have, an Apple product, you have a screen reader already built into your computer. It's called VoiceOver. It can be a little confusing how to start using it and understanding it, but they have a really good tutorial in VoiceOver and then on Apple's VoiceOver website to help train you how to use the VoiceOver app correctly. Let's see. And also, just a quick thing, one thing that I have noticed is image links. So you'll have you have a image here and then you have a link here, but the image is also going to the same link as the link there. That can be like a redundant link. So we want to make sure that we're nesting our links properly too. It's just one thing that I had noticed last night when I was going over a few things. So I wanted to make sure that I called out that we want to make sure that we're structuring links that have text and images properly, or else when we're going through it with a screen reader, it's a lot of redundant information. So is anyone in here responsible for either managing content or editing content or anything like that? Great, this slide's for you guys. So you guys have a very important role with ensuring, future accessibility. So, working in an agency that manages many different sites, I'm not running accessibility tests on your site every day, but you might be adding content to your website every day. So I highly recommend using the CK Editor's Accessibility Checker. If you do not have this, if you have a Drupal site and you don't have this installed on your WYSIWYG, ask your developers to enable this plugin. And this is what it looks like. It's that button right up, you can put the button anywhere, but what it does is by simply clicking that button will not just highlight accessibility issues in your content, but it will oftentimes just fix it for you. It also gives you a reason why it's an error. So for example, skipping heading levels like H1, H2, H3, is a violation. So if you go from an H1 to an H3, that's not okay. And a lot of times, at least in my experience, when people are skipping these heading levels, it's because they like the way a heading looks over another one. So this type of stuff is like what I like to call like a reinforcement layer, because it explains why something is wrong. And people also don't like alerts yelling at them for when they're doing something wrong. So I think it trains content editors a bit too. So we also want to make sure that we check our content's reading level. And another tool that I highly recommend is called HemingwayApp.com. So this is actually when I pasted my script into Hemingway app. It highlights areas that are either hard to read or areas for improvement. So let's say that you're using a lot of run-on sentences. It'll highlight it and say, like, oh, we'll break this up. Things like adverbs, you either want to have 2 or fewer. It just highlights, where your content could be easier to understand. And then it gives you a grade up there. So this was like a grade 10, and it says aim for grade 9, but we really want to aim for grade 6. One thing I will say about this is it could be slightly more accessible, because right now we're using only color to identify problems. They could use some icons here, but still a great app, and I use it for even like writing emails. And also you want to, and please write meaningful links. Link text like read more or learn more mean absolutely nothing out of context. And if you're listening on a screen reader, depending on how your content's marked up, it can be really confusing to readers, because they might be like, oh, well, like read more about what? I don't know what I'd be reading more about. So, and if you're going through an accessibility checker like Wave, this will be flagged as a redundant link, because typically if we have read more one place on a web page, there's usually like 12 more of them someplace. So please write meaningful links. So a little bit on retrofitting, audits, and maintenance. So these strategies that we just talked about are great if you're in a position to either be redesigning or redeveloping or doing considerable development on a site. But if you're not in that position, when you might you'll want to see if retrofitting is even an option for you. But there are still things that you can do. The first is to identify whether this is something that you can do in-house or you need to contact a vendor for. If you don't have the in-house capacity to deploy and even make these changes, you might want to consider a vendor. And when you're considering a vendor, make sure that they not only have a lot of testimonials from people, but you want to make sure that they work, they have a lot of experience in your specific industry. And if you're going to go down the DIY route, you want to make sure that you have a clear set of expectations and milestones along with the timeline of how you can implement these changes. And accessibility audits are a great way to identify where your site is lacking in accessible functionality. So a quick word on actually what an audit is. It is a checklist of whether or not your site meets its organizational compliance success criterion. It is a reference point of where your site is at a specific point in time in compliance, and it is a roadmap for future enhancements to better serve users with limitation. It is not the end-all be-all factor of whether or not your site is truly a great experience to an end user with a disability. While our site may pass all of these success criterion, it is highly encouraged to still use actual assistive technology and survey actual users to see how you can make improvements and enhancements. So, and all the tools that are out there, whether it's the Wave extension or, your Google Dev tools, they can only tell you so much. Like even all these automated tools, they can tell you so much. Like they can tell you, that you have alt text on an image, but it can't tell you if that alt text is, actually makes sense or it's a quality alt tag. So a successful audit is done by an actual human with the help of these tools. So it is a manual process. And it is not scary. An accessibility audit is definitely not scary. You should really think of it as a roadmap for how you can help prioritize and execute needed changes. And the W3C has a really great evaluation tool, and I'll be posting all of these links on the slides after this presentation. It's called the Website Accessibility Evaluation Report Generator. And it just helps you go step by step, page by page, what you're looking for, check marks, and it generates a report for you. And I personally use it. And lastly, communication. We can't anticipate how all users are going to be using our site. So having a page on our site that's easily findable, that maps out, your commitment to web accessibility, the timeframes that you're working against, and who they can contact if users having a problem or a frustration with your website. And it's not just email info@something.com. It should be like, email Kara Gaulrapp at kara@messageagency.com, like somebody with an actual name. Because this last bit, this communication, this is the lack of it, this is what gets people sued. A lot of times these lawsuits come out of users who have contacted a website about their frustrations, and then these users have been blown off time and time again by this site. So communication is a really big thing here. So how do you guys get people to care? Now, hopefully I've gotten you guys to care, but how do we get others to? In a perfect world, like I said, doing the right thing isn't always reason enough. So to get buy-in, we're going to use those logical business cases that we talked about and statistics around website usage to drive your point home. We want to keep talking and keep asking questions. Don't be afraid to just keep going up to your designer and being like, well, why does this take a mouse user 1 click to get here, but it takes somebody with a keyboard, 5 minutes to get to this same page? If you keep being a constant reminder that we're here to serve all users, it'll help reinforce people across the team that this is very much important. And it's also important to share responsibility. It's not just a developer's responsibility, a designer, a project manager, or a content editor's responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility to make sure that we're meeting compliance. So a few closing thoughts before Q&A. Personally, the words disability and special needs has always bothered me. We call them disabilities or special needs because people who have them sometimes require assistance or more support to perform the same tasks as other people. But these aren't special needs, they're functional needs. And when we start thinking about these things as more functional needs, suddenly the word disability is irrelevant. If everything was accessible from our apps and our websites to how we communicate and teach and share, we see that we're all just people. So our physical and our cognitive differences are just that. They're differences. They're not hindrances or limitations, but unfortunately, sometimes we build things that build in these limitations. So it's our duty as humans and as advocates and as good corporate citizens to create inclusive experiences that can reach as many people as possible. So I empower you all to go out into the world, become an accessibility evangelist, and make others in your life evangelists as well. So with that, we'll go into question time. I'm not really on social media, so you'll either have to grab me here or email me. And then we have our website link up here, and I have my email address. So guys have any questions? Happy to answer them. Yes?
You mentioned about all the forms having labels. Does it mean it has to have a label above the field, or is it okay to put like the field label inside?
So when you put it inside, sometimes that's considered placeholder text or like a default value. You really want to have a label there. So you might be able to put the placeholder, you might be able to format that placeholder text to be more of a label, but you really want to have a label there. And I know sometimes like designers or people don't like that because it just adds too much to a page, but it's honestly just really good practice because you need to have a label tied to an element. So it really is best practice. You really should have take it out of placeholder text too. You can have your placeholder text, but you should have form labels as well. Yes?
You had mentioned like heading 1, heading 2. What's the correct placement of like? I had to change some stuff to change the way stuff displayed on before I figured out the WYSIWYG and how to enable things that weren't enabled. Mm-hmm. And so now I need to go back and fix like heading 1, heading 2. What's the correct layout for that on a website?
So, so heading 1 would technically be your page title, right? So you would have, you can have more than like one heading 1 on a page, but I like to keep it one, and that would be like the page title because everything else should be about that title. If it's not somehow related to that title, like put it on a different page. So basically, if you have your heading 1, you can have as many headings as you want, they just can't skip. So you would have your, so heading 2 would be the one directly following that. Heading 3 would be about heading 2. So it's kind of like, it's basically a way to like chunk information. So you can't go from like H1 to H3 or like, H2 to H4, it would be H1 to H2, H2 to H3, and then you can go back, right? Because it's like, think of it like a tree or like an outline. If you're putting together like an outline, you can think of it like that, and like bullet points, because like the bullet points underneath the main one, go back, but you can still go back and make new ones.
Put a heading 2, and then the subtext would be heading 3, and then the next big point would be another heading 2, then heading 3.
Yeah, it's like, so you could have like a heading 2, and then you can have like paragraphs under there, and stuff. And then if there's like a sub point to like heading 2, that's when you would do that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Any books or videos you would recommend on this topic for somebody who's trying to take a deep dive?
So I mean, a really, really good place to start is the W3C site, because they have they have a lot of resources there. Though I will say it's very text heavy, so it could be a lot to parse through. There are there's like, there's sites like Accessible Components that's really good. There's a few more that I can share with you after this because I have a whole list of them on my computer. But things like also like inclusive design principles. There's books about that. That's it's like I said, it takes a really like good like empathetic approach to accessibility. But yeah, I wish there was like a web accessibility for dummies book because, it takes a lot of time to like, not only like, read this information, but to like understand and like parse it. And there's like, still even times like when I'm going through an audit, like I'm like, okay, I'm like, well, I'm not exactly sure like where this like bit falls. So it's always, it's always a continuous learning experience.
There are a bunch of books out there. I was just searching for them. It's just the question is who explains it really well.
Yeah, I would go with somebody who has a lot of like really good reviews on it. I personally I just go on websites for it. I haven't read any web accessibility books. Lynda.com has a really good web accessibility intro. So if you guys have a Lynda.com if you have a lynda.com account, I really recommend going through that because they break it up by those the four principles that I showed you like on the first few slides. They break it out like, okay, like what exactly is this? Like what do I test against this? So lynda.com is like actually like good way to like practice it as well. Yes?
You mentioned about meaningful links. We have a problem with marketing people not understanding to not do click here, read more, learn more. Do you have any good sources of where to best explain that information on best explaining it?
Yeah, so the best place would be on the W3 site, and they'll explain like why read more is bad. Also there's a lot of really great Medium articles about it. Ways that you can still keep your read more links, but still have them be accessible is you can put in you can show read more, but then you can have like the visually hidden class or like the screen reader only class that'll pull in, and you can have a developer pull in like, let's say like the title into that. So at least if somebody is, going through it with a screen reader, it's read to them, read more about, and then it would be the title. So that would be like, so if like you do want to keep those links, that's how I would get around that. Yes.
What are your thoughts about things like slideshows and hover pop-up effects and their effect on accessibility? And
So-
is there something that we should do instead or as an add-on?
Yeah, so pop-ups are like kind of tricky. So it's like depending on what that pop-up is. Like if let's say, I'm on a page and it says open modal to fill this out. Like at least then I know when I'm clicking on it, there's going to be a change of content and context. But things like if I'm about to exit out of a site and a pop-up comes up asking me to, sign up for your newsletter, like that's not very accessible. Because also depending on how somebody's going through that, with like an assistive technology, they might not be able to back out of that. So it's, there's like subscribe to my newsletter things that like pop up just about you're about to like, exit. Like those things are just like annoying to begin with, but they're also usually not very accessible. So, it really depends on the nature of your pop-ups and your modals.
Like in this case, it would be an image and it would be a pop-up effect so that you can get more information about the person that's
Okay, so so if you, I would say just make it clear that that's what's going to happen if if they click on this picture, if they click on this link, because also too sometimes when we create those things, tabbing through a website might have an effect that is not intended, like so. For instance, if I'm like tabbing through it, I might accidentally like trigger something like that. And I'm like, whoa, like where did this come from? So, making sure that the way that that's structured and the way that that kind of stuff gets activated, is tested against like, assistive technology and doesn't like, accidentally get triggered by, somebody doing something unintended. we have any other questions? Yes.
I don't have a question. I just say I know there's a lot of university folks in this room. If your university or your organization receives federal grant money, you are required to be AA accessible.
Georgia Tech is working really hard on it.
Yeah.
Because there's schools that have already been sued for it. So
Yeah.
we've got people who have a role as accessibility, but getting to that person to look at everything is a challenge.
Yeah.
You know, and one thing too to take into consideration is a lot of times these things are tested against, like, you know, the 2.0 guidelines. They just released the 2.1, which takes things like mobile experience and mobile accessibility into consideration, and that can be a nightmare. So I would very much read up on the differences between 2.0 and 2.1. There's not a whole lot of stuff that's, you know, changed, but the stuff that has changed is pretty big. So, so unless there's any more questions.
There is, but it's probably time, so.
Okay. Well, if you have a question, I'm more than happy to answer it afterwards. So thank you guys all for coming.